I'm Aimee Ng, for those of you who have not heard me drone on and on about Moroni already over the last 4 months, Associate Curator here at the Frick and co-curator of Moroni, The Riches of Renaissance Portraiture. That's the exhibition that inspired today's event and which sadly closes today. You will have about another hour and a half after the end of this program to visit the show before the museum closes tonight. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the Frick. And I'd like to acknowledge this place, this site, the former home of Henry Clay Frick and his family. It's a place of beauty, of great privilege, and complexity. There are many histories here which we can't see today, and I want to acknowledge some of these. I acknowledge this land of the Lenape and Wappinger people, the Lenox Library that once stood here, the workers who built this building, and the custodians of this collection, the curators of the Frick, past and present, among which I acknowledge I am the first who is not of European descent. The Moroni show is about one Italian Renaissance artist, but I hope that the objects in the show have allowed our visitors a glimpse into his wider world, of who is not depicted in his portraits, but whose stories are in the galleries with us. Already, Moroni's famous tailor has been seen to suggest that Moroni's portraiture was more inclusive socioeconomically than was conventional in Renaissance Italy, so that a working tailor could afford to be painted, and with the dignity Moroni gives to his aristocrats and nobles. The fragment of 16th century brocade I show you on the right, shown with Moroni's portrait of a young woman. It's gold and silver thread, each strand comprising a silk thread with a thin strip of gold or silver wound by hand around it, and that's a microscopic view of that textile. Incredible amount of labor. This was made by unnamed persons who devoted enormous time and skill to produce the luxurious, labor-intensive textiles that we see in so many Renaissance portraits. This Spanish pendant cross of emeralds and pearls on the far right, shown with Moroni's Isotto Brembati, and in the middle is a detail of the similar pendant worn around her neck. The Spanish pendant cross tells the story of 1557, just after Moroni probably painted the portrait, when Spain colonized Colombia, and with it the rich emerald mines and its miners at Muzo. From this point, Spain began importing huge quantities of Colombian emeralds into Europe and Asia. And this had an effect on European jewelry design, and needless to say, on Colombia. The issue of difference, of diversity of people, comes up in this first edition of St. Ignatius of Loyola's Spiritual Exercises of 1541. Now that's shown with the so-called sacred portraits in the gallery. We display it open to the page in which Loyola tells his reader to think about people of color and of other cultures, to think of everyone in the world, some white, some black, some people who dress in various ways and act in different ways, and to imagine that everyone together is going to hell. The exercise, of course, is for the European reader to understand that he or she can save his or her soul through devotion to Christianity, which has its own complicated history. Lastly, I'm showing you on the right a page from a pattern book in the show, an acknowledgement of women's work. The needlework on the collars and cuffs of men, like in this portrait, may have been made by women using books like these, which were published for women, encouraging them to produce this kind of needlework in the home as a pursuit of both fashion and virtue. Indeed, the riches of Renaissance portraiture is about much more than the sitters we see in the paintings. Today's panel is about questions of who is represented in portraiture and art, and how to tell the stories of the unrepresented. And I'm honored to welcome this impressive group of panelists who will come up individually to introduce themselves and their work They're given 5 minutes each, and I know I'm already over. Before they do, it's my show, I think I can do this. A few words about our moderator, Lucy Lang, Executive Director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution. Lucy is a tireless advocate, inspiring teacher, innovative leader and scholar, among many other roles and accomplishments. She previously served as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan for 12 years, where she investigated and prosecuted violent street crime and homicides. Yes, do not mess with Lucy. And most recently served as special counsel for policy and projects and executive director of the Manhattan DA Academy, a resource for professionals working at the intersection of law and public policy. Her work is largely focused on giving voice to marginalized groups in policy making, particularly in the criminal justice system. We are so honored that she will moderate our panel today, as I am to welcome our panelists to the podium. I'll just ask you to please silence your phones. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Bell Brown. I'm a writer and independent curator based here in New York. And I just want to ask a quick question before I begin. I'm speaking about a project I did at Gracie Mansion recently, and I just wanted to ask, how many of you have been to Gracie Mansion before? Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to talk today about an exhibition I curated at the invitation of First Lady Shirlane McCray called She Persists, A Century of Women Artists in New York. Having moved into the residence in 2014, only to find that what was on the walls was not necessarily reflected of the city's first interracial family of Italian and Bayesian descent, and arguably not a reflection of the diversity of New Yorkers of all walks of life. Ms. McCray knew she wanted to make a change and breathe new life into the walls and enlisted my help. The show marked the first time in Gracie's 220-year history that the entirety of the stately rooms of the mayoral residence were filled with artworks exclusively made by women. It's also the most extensive display of modern and contemporary art that has ever been on view there since the 1960s. Gracie is not a museum. It's not a white cube, in which I'm most familiar with sort of curating within. It's a living, breathing historical site and the preeminent seat of power in the city. So what does it mean to usher in a new era of the public image of Gracie, anchored by the accomplishments of women artists, when a woman has not yet occupied the highest seat of power, either for our city or of our nation? So the only way out of such a predicament, which we did acknowledge, was the looming inequality and asymmetry was to lean into it, to highlight and amplify the voices of a diverse and inclusive set of people who have refused to remain on history's sidelines. So 44 artists and 63 art objects later, from painting to sculpture to print, video, and film, we made She Persists. So here we see a sculpture by Kara Walker entitled Invasive Species, which greets visitors upon the entrance to the house. It's a headless monument to the underbelly of colonialist expansion. Walking through the doors of the Wagner entrance, however, they'll also see the 20th century avant-garde portraits of the social worlds of Wall Street, art, Broadway, et cetera, in New York, created by Florian Stettheimer, which you'll see on your right. But the meta-narrative of She Persists was this acknowledgement of the blatant inequality that women, especially women of color, face not only in the world at large, but also in the world of culture. So we would have been remiss to not show the Guerrilla Girls 1985 print poster that called out the art world for its patriarchy and sexism in museums, cultural institutions, and popular culture. So the 13 advantages of being a woman artist, which we see here, is a symbolic entry point into this exhibition. Their call to attention for the social inequalities that remain relevant today, nearly 3 decades later, is still very prescient. So the Guerrilla Girls challenge us to underscore how gender and bias are inextricably linked to our cultural value systems, and how perceptions about difference and identity can structure real and lasting outcomes as we move throughout the world in our everyday lives. Other works on view were paintings like those of Jennifer Packer. So we see here a really beautiful floral arrangement sort of painted against this fiery yellow background. But this also serves as a funerary bouquet for Sandra Bland. The piece is called Say Her Name. And Sandra Bland, as we may know, was a Black woman who died in the hands of police custody in 2015, and her story sort of galvanized the support of Black Lives Matter. In the drawing rooms, we were really able to sort of amp up this idea of provocation through constellation. So on your left, or from left to right, we see Betty Parsons, a famed Ab-X dealer who was a prodigious painter in her own right, Simone Lee, and works by Alice Neal. In other drawing rooms, I won't have the time to talk about everything, but we wanted to play up also juxtapositions between greater and lesser known artists, like Helen Frankenthaler on your far right on the bottom, and on the top, the circular sort of painting by Betty Blayton Taylor, one of the co-founders of the Studio Museum in Harlem. Both artists working abstractly and not necessarily talked about along a sort of continuous art historical canon. Lastly, one of the major themes of the exhibition too was sort of thinking about an expansion of abstraction. So on your right, you see a beautiful painting by Carmen Herrera, whose minimalist geometric abstractions sort of predated those of Frank Stella. On your left, you'll see 2 print works by queer artist Isabel Bishop, who in the late 30s and 40s sort of documented the entrance of women into the workplace, who sort of sat on her window, from her window, observing Union Square, and made, I think, I would call social documents of such a transformative time. We also included the work of artists like Faith Ringgold, who was educated at City College and was told that she couldn't get a degree in art, so she had to do a program in education. But that didn't stop her from making paintings and prints and quilts, etc. This is the original Tar Beach story quilt, a story that she published on Cassie Lightfoot, who dreamed of flying over the George Washington Bridge. Cassie lived in Sugar Hill, what's now known as Sugar Hill, and the story is set during the height of segregation. So in short, I want to just close by saying we attempted to use unimaginable juxtapositions that one would sort of see in a museum, sort of think about ways to radicalize the public spaces of Gracie. And I invite you to ask more questions during the Q&A later in the program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Blake Bradford. I am here as the founder and director of Points of Entry, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I wanted to just acknowledge our friends here at the Frick, so Rika and Persephone and Amy and the rest of the team. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I wanted to talk a fair amount about projects that I've been involved with in Philadelphia, a little bit beyond Philadelphia over the last 10 years, and really thinking about participation. For folks who are in the museum field, one of the things that has been a buzz of late is talking about diversity and representation on a lot of fronts, especially around employment. If we look at what the statistics are in terms of who directs these institutions, who makes decisions at these institutions, who are the people who control the budgets, and also who sits in the positions of governance at the larger institutions. That the idea of representation is problematic when we look at just the raw numbers. And so the work that I've been doing has both been informed by that and sort of hopefully a response to that. And then if folks can see, and there with the saxophonist Ken Vandermark working on a project for his group Made to Break that was presented in 2014, looking at if folks are familiar with the Barnes, these unique kinds of juxtapositions. So you could go into a room and see Renoir and Cézanne and Matisse, as well as African cultural artifacts and medieval art and door knockers and lots of these different stuff on the walls. So exploring notions of hybridity and thinking about objects out of the box. So at the Barnes, the mission of the Barnes Foundation is to promote the advancement of education, the appreciation of fine art. That was established at its charter in 1922, but if you listen to what that is, what does that really mean in terms of its activities? What does the founder, how does the founder inform this? So Albert Barnes was, for the time, he lived from 1872 to 1951, oversaw his eponymous foundation from 1922 till his death, and he was a progressive for his time. And so we looked at the progressive agenda that we saw as really the heart of the mission. Barnes was an advocate for, in particular, African-American artists, African-American culture. And then another part that, again, my colleagues in museums will look at is just like, how can you take these institutions that are legacy and memory institutions and find a space to experiment, to think about future practices and model practices. And so there on your right is a program called The Art of Looking for 5th and 6th graders, where we utilized works from the collection with 5th and 6th graders to create these curriculum-aligned projects where, for example, they would look at a painting in the collection, a two-dimensional painting, and create, using their math skills, apply that to creating a three-dimensional representation of those spaces, so looking at proportion and perspective and all of those things. And one other aspect of the program that I should mention is that because of the challenges in working with the Philadelphia Public Schools around going for a field trip, we had to have curriculum-aligned programs, and these programs were also presented in 2 trips at the school and 1 trip to the Barnes Foundation. And so it was really this more longitudinal kind of engagement for them. So from the Barnes Foundation, I moved on to Lincoln University, and it was a partnership with the Barnes Foundation. And how do we bring students and prepare them for careers and career opportunities in the museum field? On the right is an image of me working with students from Temple University's Young Curators Council and my students at Lincoln. We're there at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The woman there, excellent, Jackie Serwer, who's a curator of their art collection. And so these high-impact opportunities and engagements with professionals in the field would become platforms for them to think about their participation. So over the last 10 years, it's really been about thinking about how institutions model these kinds of inclusive practices, sincere outreach, and how you can have these expansive conversations. Again, in institutions that might be seen as inherently conservative, because you've got this investment in collections, an investment in infrastructure, an investment in an historical mission. This is a panel called Who is We that I participated in Moore College of Art and Design in 2016. So topics I'm exploring now: how we cultivate institutional environments that are representative and are characterized by trust, inclusion, and belonging. And then how can we protect spaces where we can ask and address questions that might make us uncomfortable? Finally, I'm working on a project called Points of Entry that aligns programs for youth and creates a more intentional workforce development pipeline, thinking about 13 to 19-year-olds, where if we talk about diversity, well, what are we actually doing to build the workforce that we desire? How do we think about that? How do we become more intentional, where many of us are lucky to have sort of fallen into the field and found a mentor? Well, what if instead of meeting us halfway, we went further down the path to really embrace students, like these students at a program, Students at Museums in Philadelphia. There are 25,000 students who are enrolled in this program. How do we build this into a career path for them and create the opportunities that will create the museum workforce of the future? So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm an art historian, and my name is Susan Kahn. I'm the Dean of the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. And I have tremendous admiration for the work that went into the Moroni exhibition. The scholarly research and close readings of the pieces presented in the catalog and the thoughtful pairing of objects in the galleries is a tremendous feat, as is the research and organization needed for a show of this magnitude and complexity. As an educator and curator, I've devoted the majority of my career to expanding the range and diversity of art presented in museums. My most recent book is on the impact of the civil rights movement on museums in the United States through a series of case studies of museums in New York City, the Metropolitan, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Whitney. I explore how the efforts of arts activists succeeded in desegregating museums in some respects, but also modified and preserved the racial system that was in place before the civil rights movement. For about 15 years, I was a museum educator. In this role, the work that I'm most proud of is a series of projects that I initiated and led while I was the curator of education at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in the 1980s and early 90s. These projects that you see in these images, we called visitor participation projects. They were designed to expand the conversation around art by making a place for the voices of visitors, voices that were not recognized as a legitimate part of the conversation around art. The voices of museum visitors were added to those of curators, critics, art historians, collectors, funders, and other art world insiders. Now, this was a particularly appropriate approach because we were presenting at the New Museum contemporary art, art whose meanings were not yet codified or canonized. And I'm just going to briefly describe what you're looking at in the top left-hand image is a project that we did called Homemade TV, in which visitors could borrow camcorders, and this was in 1989, so camcorders were not yet widely available, to make videotapes about their own experience growing up with television in an exhibition devoted to the history of the television set. And the galleries were designed to replicate domestic settings. So the visitors could actually use these gallery installations as the sets to produce their videos. And then they were given a copy of their video to take home. They were invited back to do a weekend workshop to edit their tape. And then the finished tapes were actually incorporated into the exhibition, enabling the audience members to take an actual active role in the creation of content in the exhibition itself. Now, often a challenge for museums presenting esoteric historical material is how do you make it relevant for an audience today? And with respect to the current exhibition of work by Moroni, I find the decision to include a selection of complementary objects quite fascinating. This decision adds a material historical resonance to the exhibition. In imagining other strategies for expanding the conversation around this work, what immediately came to my mind was the work of an artist named Cahan Wiley, who most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with because he was commissioned to do the presidential portrait of Barack Obama in 2016. Wiley's portraits of everyday men and women and important contemporary figures riff on specific paintings by old masters, replacing the European aristocrats depicted in those paintings with contemporary black subjects, thus drawing attention to the absence of African Americans from historical and cultural narratives typically presented in museums. The subjects in Wiley's paintings often wear clothing or carry evocative objects, not unlike the subjects in Moroni's paintings. And these individuals are set against ornate decorative backgrounds that evoke earlier eras and a range of cultures. Some of Wiley's paintings are based on street casting, in which he invites individuals, often strangers he encounters on the street, to sit for portraits. In this collaborative process, the model chooses a reproduction of a painting from a book and reenacts the pose of the painting's figure. By inviting the subjects to select their work of art, Wiley gives them a measure of control over the way they're portrayed and inserts them into distinguished history. His most recent project at the St. Louis Art Museum was an exhibition of people living in Ferguson, Missouri, the city where the uprising occurred in August 2014 after the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by police officer Darren Wilson. The unrest in Ferguson sparked a vigorous debate in the United States about the relationship between law enforcement officers and African Americans and the use of force by police in Missouri and nationwide. Powerfully introducing the citizens of Ferguson into the museum, Wiley based these portraits on paintings in the museum's own collection, thus drawing upon and expanding the Western tradition. All these projects that I've mentioned and that we're hearing about this afternoon remind us that culture matters because it defines who we are, and it unifies us within social fabric. It enables us to see beyond our individual identities and interests. And institutions like this matter because they have the power to publicly declare what is valued by society, what people are valued by society or not. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rika, Aimee, and the Frick for hosting all of us. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Risham Majeed. I specialize in both historical African art and Western medieval art. And I'm just going to present a little bit around a question of how we came to create an idea of the primitive. And in so doing, I pegged this analysis on historical considerations of collections that no longer exist in the same way that they did in the 19th century during the height of the colonial period. So what you're looking at over here, right, is a confrontation between Picasso's famous Head of Fernand, which is at the MoMA now, and a Fang reliquary guardian figure. So the relationship between modernist primitivism as that has become emblematic of Picasso's work and its dealings with African art is quite well known, and that's what's being shown here. But the larger frame that you're seeing around it is the cloisters. It's the chapel of St. Martin from Fuente Dueña in northern Spain from the 12th century. And so this is really what was not in the picture of modernist primitivism when I started my research. And so in that confrontation between African and sort of avant-garde modernism at the early 20th century, the thing that's always been missing is the role of the kind of autochthonous or auto-primitivism that happens at the turn of the 20th century through medieval art for the French. Things don't sort of come fully formed to us, right? We have ideas that have been building over a period of time, and medieval art as it was considered in the light of the museums of the Trocadero, which I'll show you in a second, formed a kind of pre-furnished idea of the primitive that was then extended to African art. And this is a history that's not really known widely anymore because the museums from which it emerges have been destroyed. So what you see on the top there is the Trocadero Palace, which is where the Chaillot Hill is now, where you go and take your selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower. That's where that structure used to be. And it was destroyed for the World's Fair of 1937, but it housed these two very important museums. One was the Museum of Ethnography, where Picasso had his famous encounter with African art. And on the right is the Museum of Comparative Sculpture, which had casts of medieval buildings from the 12th century, and then as the museum developed into the 13th and 14th centuries. The comparative element was to locate French Romanesque, the earliest part of medieval art from the 11th to the 12th centuries, as the kind of indigenous primitive to which African art and oceanic art were then compared continuously through the juxtaposition that was made available through these museums. The idea that Picasso was primarily only engaged with the non-West in his conceptualization of the now canonical painting, Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is also in MoMA, was part and parcel of yet another exhibition, which was Primitivism in Modern Art, Affinities of the Tribal and the Modern, which took place, of course, at the Modern in 1984. And even there, they did not show you the other side of the Trocadero. They only showed you the Museum of Ethnography, and that's what I'm showing you up there, are masks related to the painting of 1907 in the center, and on the right side, a kind of simulation of the galleries of the Trocadero on the right. But nowhere in the exhibition was medieval art ever introduced or considered as a kind of predecessor to the primitivism that the show was advocating, that we know so well with regard to Picasso. And so just to summarize, this is from William Rubin, who was the catalog and the chairman of the Department of Paintings at the Museum of Modern Art before he died. He acknowledges that Picasso went to the Trocadero to look at Romanesque sculpture, not at African art. And that for him, there was a logical sense of the non-naturalistic, the primitive, the anonymous artist that had appealed to him. And then only by chance did he sort of step into the Museum of Ethnography, and he carried with him the associations that he had already built around medieval art and extended them to African art. Now, today, all of that is missing, right? When you go to MoMA, the painting is entirely on its own. It actually no longer even has companion pieces of the same period that it used to a few years ago. So all of these kinds of additive histories that led to this canonical piece of modernist primitivism of the beginnings of Picasso's Cubist period, in fact, owe a lot to something that preceded the colonial project. So I'll end with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all so much. I'm Lucy Lang and have the privilege of moderating the upcoming conversation. If you'll just bear with us, we're going to lower the screen and have the panelists take our seats. I'd love to start the conversation in really broad strokes on why it matters that we're having this conversation at all. Susan, you concluded by saying that one of the real issues here is that who's represented in art is that it reflects which people are valued. Do you or others have other thoughts on why it matters who's represented?
I'll go. So I think one part of that is, as we're seeing now in the present sort of postmodern moment, is the idea of history as something that is complex and not specifically convenient. Just thinking about, especially as we see it in these institutions that reflect a kind of power, the opportunity to include histories and peoples, and to look at this as something expansive, or there's also the converse for me of thinking about a sort of arrogant narrative where it's like this is the way it is. Even somebody like Moroni just got kind of written out of art history. Really, before I was involved with this project, it wasn't somebody who I knew as a mid-16th century Italian artist. And the sort of easy moment of Bernard Berenson saying, yeah, this guy wasn't that important, and he's out. And so, but these ideas of rediscovery and realizing, and I'm trying to remember who was talking about it. I guess, Jessica, you were talking about the complexity of some of the stories, and Aimee as well, in terms of what is represented and who, the sort of royal who, is represented in some of the portraits. And I think, looking at this as what you're seeing being more complex, and how you approach the world as thinking about, well, maybe there's more here to see, is an important kind of pivot for me in terms of thinking about ideas of representation.
So on that score, is there something unique about the function that portraiture fills in our tradition that makes it a particularly salient question as compared to city scenes or other kinds of art?
I'll take a go at that one. So, portraiture, I think that in the way that the exhibition addresses it, is we're looking at portraiture not just in the sense of an individual who's being commemorated, but as portraits as kind of ambassadors of ideas, right? So portraits don't necessarily need to be representational of a person. You can also have, form a portrait of an entire place or period, as museums do, right, through an accumulation of objects. And objects then become a kind of portrait of a time or a place. So I think we have to be, as this Moroni show is, really flexible about what you include when you're constituting a kind of image of an age or a person.
I actually don't think that portraiture holds a special place in questions of representational politics, if you will. I mean, I think that the question of representation in museums is really complicated, and it has a lot of different dimensions. And so, when we walk into this building and we know that it was, the Frick home, that is an aspect of representation, that this building becomes a museum. How and why is it that a building like this is, sort of a prefabricated museum? And then in my own work, as I discuss the issue of audience representation, I think is really important, and interpretation, because the process of interpretation is also engaged with issues of representation. Whose voices, who's framing the questions that are being asked, who's framing the dialogue? And I think that if you, just to very simply suggest how even subject matter itself is even if it's not portraiture, that issues of representation are involved. If you think about the Ashcan School and what the Ashcan School was trying to do in represent certain aspects of society that were not necessarily celebrated, but that they felt deserved attention. All throughout art history, Western art history, you can find examples of artists really pushing at the envelope of what is representable within the frame of art. And so I see this as being part of, the issues of representation being part of much larger systemic questions of the interrelationship between these different elements.
Yeah, I want to add, in thinking about your question, Lucy, and your response, Susan, I'm thinking about portraiture as in a contemporary or more recent sort of notion that, so if I refer back to the Alice Neal, portrait that I included in the show at Gracie, it's this anti-Madonna and child representation of Jenny Neal, Alice Neal's daughter-in-law, and Jenny's newborn baby. And we see this sort of frenzy or this real palpable sense of anxiety, postpartum anxiety. And for Alice Neal to take that opportunity to sort of, in 1974, at the height of the feminist movement, to give this picture of motherhood that's not so rosy, It's such a radical gesture to make. And to imagine that piece being either at a place like Gracie Mansion or, let's say, in a museum space, it opens up a series of conversations that, that museum goers and visitors can have with a work of art, to see their experiences sort of recognized by someone else. And that shift, I think, is a relatively new territory for Western modern and contemporary context, because at the turn of the 19th century, museums were envisioned as places to make good citizens. And now one of the major aspects of going to museum spaces, second to leisure, is this kind of idea of finding yourself or your experiences reflected in what you see. So portraiture becomes, I think, a critical sort of thread of that, that type of encounter.
That's beautiful. Going down to the micro now, when this museum first opened to the public, it had a public panel been convened of experts, it wouldn't look like this panel. And I wonder if this question is personal to each of you, and if so, what is it that sort of personally motivates you to take on these questions of representation in your own work? And I'd love to hear from all of you, if you would. It's not personal. No, it's purely political.
Blake, alphabetical.
I guess
Jessica.
I think the personal is always political. And for me, having had a long-standing relationship with the field, like from undergrad to now, I've always sort of sought to, I always look to artists to tell those stories. That artists will always sort of light the path for me. So I think that's sort of a mantra or ethos that guides the kind of work that I do, whether I'm writing or putting together an exhibition, that I really sort of center the voices set before me by the sort of artists who are participating in, or the objects that have that exist in my shows.
So I've been in museums for a long time and thinking about, in its way, just how they haven't felt like participatory spaces. I mean, it's like I've been in museums for a long time and I've participated, but also just, you look around and you can see who goes to shows, or what is, I was having a conversation with a friend and he was talking about working in a contemporary art institution, a contemporary art museum, and it's like, once you call yourself that, you've sort of made a specific ethnographic choice about your audience. And for me, feeling like there is something more possible around the idea of like representation. You go to Philadelphia and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there's a sort of declaration of who it's for and what it has. But if you were to go there, your experience of like, well, Philadelphia just, for example, is a city that's like 52% black. And when you see institutions that say Philadelphia, who's participating in those, So there's a sort of, I wouldn't say it's optimism all the time, but it's always an idealism about what museums could be, because I think as we discuss this, there's this idea that museums are so deeply informative to our culture, our sense of our larger selves, and so that we could help museums sort of repair a relationship. That's sort of where the idealism comes from.
That's a big question. First of all, I'm going to make a plug for my book called Mounting Frustration, The Art Museum in the Age of Black Power. which looks, as I said, at the impact of the civil rights movement on museums in the United States through case studies of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, and the Whitney. And what I learned through my research is that prior to the 1960s, these museums were, with the exception of a few moments here and there, these museums were completely exclusive. And, you know, I interviewed Tom Hoving before he died, who had been the director of the Metropolitan Museum during the 60s into the early mid-70s. And he told me that when a person of color would try to enter the Metropolitan Museum in the 1960s, they would be turned away at the door. And they would be told that the museum was a private club. And this, you know, I uncovered, you know, so much historical research that gave me an idea of what the museums, generally speaking, were like prior to the civil rights movement, that I have to say that the moment that we're occupying now, in which we see museums as places where we're looking to see ourselves reflected, where we think of them as ideal spaces for instilling the possibility of a certain kind of cultural connectedness, that this is an idea of the last 50 years, that this is not an idea that predates that, although museums had other ideological agendas, as Jessica mentioned. So my own personal involvement with these issues really started very early. When I was in high school, I went to a high school where instead of taking classes your senior year, you could do an internship or an independent study and get credit for it. And I thought that that was really great because it was so much more fun to do an internship than to take classes. And my high school art teacher suggested that I apply for a high school apprenticeship at the Metropolitan. So I did, and I was hired there. And so I worked in the community programs department at the Met. I was 16. I actually worked with Rika Burnham, who's the director of education here. And you know, the community programs department was created to try to make the Metropolitan more publicly engaged and more responsive to a broader community. So my entire, and at that moment, interestingly enough, Philippe de Montebello became the director in 1978 while I was there as an intern, and the first things he did is he eliminated the community programs department. And I was left then without an internship, and that's one of the ways I got to know Rika. She and one of her colleagues took me under their wing. I'm saying all this because museums during the last 50 years have been contested spaces. They are fraught with contradiction. They are, you know, you've got elite forces at work, culturally suppressive forces at work, and then you have forces for cultural inclusion and expansivity and diversity. These contradictions I find absolutely fascinating, and so and I have devoted all of my scholarly research to exploring these contradictions. And so for me, it's both personal and it's very professional.
I think that it has to be both at the same time, in the sense that the more you try to excise your background from what you do, the more it comes to be the subject of your research. And so, you know, there's a couple of different things that you said that resonated with me, all of you. One is that representation is not reflection. So, you know, just because you are in a space doesn't mean that you are in a space that represents, you know, an entire sort of plethora of people. And those choices are still being made by people who may not have, you know, the best kind of texture of differentiation for those spaces. Meaning that you need to have a plurality of voices in the major institutions, in all fields, not just African art or Indian art or whatever sort of subcategory of the non-West you're doing. You know, people need to be able to have a kind of distinction in their approach to the Renaissance, which allows you to think about how the Renaissance wasn't a kind of closed environment of, you know, one man genius to the other, right? And then that comes from a lot of diversity of the people who are making decisions, not just the people who are being shown within the space.
Hold on to that. So thinking about the the orientation of the decision maker. I think that at the same time that the Met was turning away people of color at the door, that the Barnes would actually turn away socialites who came to the door, and so that shows these very different philosophies of largely white institutions. And I wonder what we can learn about the identity of founders, collectors, et cetera, and how you all take that into account as shepherds of I think, Blake, you called it the legacy and memory institutions, but also as innovators, as activists, as advocates for a new generation of social thought as it relates to the arts.
I guess since you mentioned the Barnes, I'll sort of start in, and I think it's an interesting challenge in being here at the Frick and thinking about that, and there's a different notion in the present tense of transparency and bias that I think is important to understand when we think about, and Risham and I were talking about some of that, the standards of the times, and how certain expectations have certainly evolved. And so, when we look at those institutions, a place like the Barnes, the inclusion and exclusion was in a lot of ways an outlier. And Barnes, because of his own background, sought to be an outlier as, he didn't consider the Barnes Foundation as a museum in the same way, and it's still like they had public days, they have art on the wall, in many ways it is, but I think he sought to be an outlier in that regard. But I think then we think about the sort of larger culture of museums and how they'd been established. There were ways that Barnes very much participated in that. There's the picture in the catalog of the David Tenyers picture that many people have seen. It's of like the collection of Archduke. I can't remember his name, but it's one of these famous personal collections of Aimee. Do you remember? Leopold. Archduke Leopold. So it's. A lot of people are familiar with these kinds of images of an institution that would predate the museum, where it was the private collector with his stuff from floor to ceiling. And that's, whether we like it or not, that's kind of the culture that museums in the present tense have grown out of, and they are still emerging from. So whether we're at an institution that might have had progressive roots or conservative roots, once you say you're a museum, that is the ground underneath your feet.
Does that ring true for you, Jessica, having done your most recent work in a home, albeit a large public political one?
I would say the interesting sort of point of note from that project is thinking about the way, so I worked for Gracie Mansion. I sort of worked with a number of New York institutions to loan works for the show, and time after time again, I would know that works would be in their collection and not on view, but museums would have such bureaucratic tape around getting objects to spaces that weren't white cube spaces. But I think also it's really difficult for institutions to lend works for shows like mine. And so I remember getting on a call with one of the curators at the Whitney, and I asked for a specific Cindy Sherman photograph. And she was like, sorry, I can't give you that. Women are in right now. And which was hilarious, but the show that the Sherman photograph was going to be in was a Whitney show, and it was going to happen 2 years from then. The photograph had come out of cold storage and was on view for a few months, and now it was going back into cold storage. So there's all of this kind of dancing that museums have to do around that kind of engagement beyond their own exhibitions, but sort of lending works to be circulated widely. I say that to bring up a point about the rise of the mega collector now and the ways in which collectors are competing with cultural institutions for some of the more significant works in our time period. And so what does it mean that works that that provoke such important conversations come out of public circulation into private hands. I think about the Barnes and Bonheur de Vivre being, before the Barnes reopened in such a public way, that painting being so important in art history, but so few people have actually laid eyes on it. So I'm being very long-winded here, but to say it's super complicated, and cultural institutions make it really difficult sometimes to enact the missions that they say that they stand for.
I think an extension of what you're talking about, Jessica, is the phenomenon of the private museum. The Broad Museum
Yes.
being the foremost example in which an individual collector or couple collecting have enough wealth and power to be able to create their own museum. And the choices that they made individually, of course informed by critical commentary and curatorial expertise, but still that they made as a couple, then become public culture. That is the really interesting phenomenon. And then, for me, as Carol Duncan has talked about in, is it Carol Duncan? In, civilizing places? Right, museums as civilizing rituals. She talks about the role of the museum visitor as being kind of a projection of the identity of the collector, and that's no, it's not Carol Duncan, it's Andrea Fraser talks about that. Andrea Fraser talks about that the role of the visitor in a museum like this or in a museum like the Broad becomes a pseudo collector, that their relationship to the artwork becomes like a kind of voyeuristic mimicry of the private collector. And what that, if you take that idea and you extend it a little bit, it becomes an erasure of their own identity. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon, but I think that the rise of the private museum is something that is probably going to be one of the primary legacies of the era that we're living in now.
I want to add to that too, because when we think about marginalized voices and marginalized identities in that sort of collector sphere, what are the implications of, I think about private collections like the Broad, the Nortons, et cetera, but when we think about, I can't think of an African American collector who has started their own institution. And so the landscape gets really myopic quite quickly if we wanted to sort of escalate the implications of that.
Thinking about that tension and all of this, do you think that our country's uniquely heinous racial history distinguishes the mandate of our arts institutions from those in other countries?
Well, I mean, it has a distinctly violent past, but so do other countries. I think the distinction to be made is the hierarchical relationship that's established between a colony and a metropole versus the sort of legacy of slavery. It comes out in different kinds of ways, right? So, I mean, in the 70s into the 80s, you have a kind of a sort of rehashing, right, through the civil rights movements of what is happening in museums, as you write in your book as well. But at the same time, this is what's going on in Europe now, is the conversation around restitution. So what relationship, do museums have to their former colonies, right, is not the same as the relationship that the Met has to African Americans, for example. So, I mean, I think we have to be very specific about issues of diversity and inclusion on a very kind of compelling timeline that's historically grounded. Because otherwise, you tend to unify something that is really quite different. And so the way that, the Met's going to deal with this issue versus, the Quai Branly or the Louvre will be entirely different, and will have a direct impact on their demographic.
I'm glad to hear that women are in right now, and I hope that it lasts. So we've had a kind of a rough run historically, but it's nearly 50 years now since the publication of Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And I wonder your thoughts on whether things have changed, whether they've changed as dramatically as they should have, and what the state of affairs is for women artists now. Bearing in mind that I think there are 5 women artists represented in this collection out of hundreds of artists overall.
I'm so cynical.
All right, lay it on us.
Well, you know, the majority of art students are women. The majority of art historians are women. There is gender hierarchy within the institutions where majority of museum workers in certain roles are women. Like, look at this. Look at who we are. Look at the audience, for God's sakes. I just feel terrible about this, but this morning I was thinking that if the art world becomes too feminized, it will lose its stature. So it's not about it's that misogyny and sexism is so deeply rooted that were women to really attain power in the art world, that the art world itself would be diminished in the popular imagination because of the sexism running so deep. And I hope I'm wrong.
Break out the wine, somebody. Other thoughts on that?
Go ahead, no, you go. Yeah, I'm hopefully pessimistic, if that makes sense. I understand that the problem is systemic and structural. It's also very much rooted in terms of how we come to know. So it goes back to how we're educated, both in school, but then also how we're socialized as well. And so how do you, I think Linda Nochlin sort of got this so right in posing the question and then also offering a criticism of that, the very nature of that question, meaning what is it about our attachments to this idea of a kind of art history that we need to sort of modify it as opposed to completely obliterating our understanding of it. I'm really sort of making broad strokes and summarizing that seminal essay, but I think fear is a very big component in sort of keeping our institutions sort of back. We realize institutions are made of people, and so all it takes is sort of one or two people in very high positions of power to really kind of completely shift the paradigm in a more localized way. And if that can happen across the board, then we'd be in a much better position. However, the moves have to also be made in our society. They can't be just in the sort of world of culture. The world of culture is a part of society at large, and certainly sort of contingent upon our biases and blind spots.
I was just gonna, many of you may have seen the Guggenheim show, the Clint show, which was, widely reviewed and well received. I think the other danger for women artists in traditionally masculine narratives is to also give them the masculine narrative, rather than to understand that Clint wasn't really, a predecessor for Kandinsky, right? She was really doing her own thing. And she may not have been involved in your grand narrative that led to Picasso and, whomever else you want to put in there. So, we resist the complexity of moments for women because we only have one model. And so, we need to throw away the model.
So does that partially account for the record-breaking sales out of Sotheby's this winter of the Women Triumphant show, which was a major sale of works by women painters? Or is that just a reflection of the commodification of women artists?
think that was a lot of marketing. And ultimately, the sale was for a good cause. Aggie Gunn and Oprah Winfrey teamed together, and some of the proceeds will go to the right place. But we've also got to recognize that this moment, we've been here before, as Thelma Golden always says, and we're going to be back here again. And so the preparedness for when this moment arises again is something that I think deserves a lot of focus as well.
You spoke a little bit, Blake, about participation, and we've been talking about the role of the viewer who comes to museums. And I wonder if there is something specific about museum education and what museum education can do in this political and artistic moment to take on the question of representation.
That's a big lift in a lot of ways. I think, when we start to see these systemic problems, sometimes I guess it almost feels disingenuous to put this on museum education when these are systemic problems. It's sort of like, what are women going to do about representation? What are African Americans going to do about? So there's a piece of it that I almost feel like what we can do in these little compartments of the problem is how we call out the problem. There are things that, the program that I've proposed, looking for funding and all of that, but ways that say the lack of diversity and representation on museum staffs, or what we say when we mean museums, is emblematic of like large-scale social problems and sort of policy problems. But how can we call those things out and take these little incremental steps, but not declare victory because we had a program that served 10,000 kids in Philadelphia public schools or something like that. I think it's sort of like we do the work, but we also acknowledge the work yet to be done.
Right.
That we'll be back at this moment.
Yeah.
Can I expand upon that? I began my career as a museum educator, and I believe that museum education is really important. But I also know that the explosive increase in museum education programs happened in the 1970s, and it has continued since then. And I believe that the rise of museum education is one of the tactics that museums used to diversify in a certain arena and avoid diversification in other arenas. And so I describe that as segregation in the guise of integration. Because if you focus on museum education as the primary side of integration, you are really focusing on the realm in which the people have the least possible power. And that's one of the things that led me to develop those visitor participation projects at the new museum, because I wanted to transform the role of the audience member from someone who was a recipient of knowledge to a knowledge producer.
Lightning round. If you could each acquire one piece to add to the Frick's collection, what would the piece be?
Given the constraints of its...
This is the realm of fantasy. Yeah.
One thing. So I would think that the impulse might be good to go into the contemporary as a kind of gloss on the past, but I think for the Frick, there's so much more kind of historical painting available that you could then pair and sort of expand ideas about the collection. And some of that is from the voyages of discovery in the 18th century, and so I might acquire a portrait of somebody that Aimee knows, a Polynesian man. Something that amplifies and engages the rest of the world, right, for a canonical piece in the collection. And I have one in mind, and Aimee can tell you about it another time.
I think the museum should commission Kahindi Wiley to do a portrait of Mark Zuckerberg.
There are a couple of approaches for me thinking about this, and maybe just because we've been talking about portraiture, it's definitely portraiture. Thinking about Barclay Hendricks, he's a Philadelphian, and his work is amazing, and I think is sort of the jumping off point for so many contemporary portraitists. The other is Mickalene Thomas in a sort of more contemporary sense, just in terms of fit.
I am thinking about an artist who I'm super excited about, Elizabeth Colomba, who actually paints Black subjects from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century in the style of sort of European painters. And she's finding a way to sort of recenter Blackness within sort of little-known narratives. And so, yeah, her work, she's contemporary, but I think her work would be super relevant to the collection.
Thank you. Take it under advisement, Frick staff. Before I invite the audience to join the panelists in the galleries, I wonder if you'll each conclude by sharing one detail from the Maroney exhibition that particularly speaks to you.
Well, okay, when you first walk in, there's a painting where the figure is wearing these chainmail sleeves. That sleeve is incredible. I just really wanted to own it. Or at least try it on.
I was walking in the galleries just briefly, and the sort of cold stare that a lot of the figures have, where they're just like, it's like this hard stare. It reminded me, actually, thinking of another work of, there's the Dawood Bey photograph of somebody outside the 125th Street Theater, or the theater on 125th Street, but just like that, you know, the little bit of a dead-eyed stare as you walk through the collection.
I think what I really liked about the Maroney show was how the tailor enables everything that you're seeing in the show. Essentially, without the tailor, you don't have any of those clothes that you're all lusting after, right? So the tailor is not only a subject, but a kind of progenitor as the artist is a progenitor as well. So I really liked that.
And I will answer the question in the galleries as we experience the work together.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rika, Persephone, Aimee, for welcoming this extraordinary panel here to the Frick. And I hope you will all join us in the galleries to continue the conversation. Thank you.